What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Scouting Combine here on the Five Reasons Sports Network. I'm joined by my co-host Eric. How we doing today, my guy?
Hey, pretty good, man. Just hanging out, waiting for schedule release, just like everybody else, and trying to occupy some time.
Of course. Now, and today's show is a part two of our post-draft series. Today, we'll be talking about the final four picks the Miami Dolphins did in the 2024 NFL Draft. And I gotta say, day three, Eric, in our perspective and our points of view, we both felt like day three was so much better initially compared to day one and day two.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that day three was kind of where we saw the whole draft come together, where we kind of saw Greer's vision and saw some of the gaps, possibly get filled that we thought may have existed with some of those earlier picks.
Yeah, of course. And let's go ahead and get into one of the first picks was Mo Kamara. Now, Mo Kamara was 6'1", 250 pounds as well. And this time, oh, I can hear the music from how it's going on there too. Let me go ahead and roll the clip. Fifth round out of Colorado State, drafted 158th overall. He finished his career with 45 and a half tackles, 30 and a half sacks, 5 forced fumbles, and he won the Mountain West Conference Defensive Player of the Year. When I watched a little bit of his tape, his technique was pretty much polished for a guy at 6'1" itself, and he had a good pass rush plan as well, and it popped out consistently. Like, he's such a diverse pass rusher where he forces a lot of offensive linemen to plan a lot for the snap because, he can come at you in different ways. And Eric, when you talk to offensive linemen in preparing for a pass rusher who has 4 to 5 different moves at any given moment, like how do you prepare for that as an offensive lineman?
Yeah, so as an offensive lineman, when you're facing somebody that has multiple effective moves, it just, you have to be on your game a lot more. If you have somebody that only has one or two moves, you can kind of set up to, take away those moves and not have to worry as much about a counter. But when you have somebody that has multiple ways that they can win and you don't know which one's coming at you, then, it really puts the pressure on you to be solid in your technique or else, run the risk of getting embarrassed by one of those counter moves.
Right. One of his best moves is usually a two-hand swipe that he uses um, to pull the offensive tackle away, and then he bends underneath, and with his speed, he tries to close in on the quarterback as well. How effective do you think that'll be in the NFL for him?
I think it depends on what else he can develop there. If that's the only thing that he can do in the NFL, then teams are going to take that away. But if he can continue to be effective with his power at times, be able to plant his foot in the dirt and get inside, then that outside rush, sweeping the hands and dipping around the corner. When you're talking about a guy that's 6'1", and you're looking at most defensive tackle or offensive tackles in the league are 6'4", 6'5" plus, it makes it tough for them to get down there and play at the same level that he's able to.
Right. You talk about him being 6'1" as well, and he's not the most athletic guy, but he is a technician when rushing the passer. He's got a relentless motor. He's got a lot of speed off the line, and a lot of his sacks, they were mainly, the product of never giving up on the reps, never giving up on the play, and, continuing the play even if he was initially blocked. Like, oh, I'm blocked, I can't do anything else. He was still trying to get after the quarterback. I mean, the effort snaps, they're not like, oh wow, look what he did. They're not like super flashy. Like, he's grinding it out. And when you're picked in the fifth round, and he was kind of angry, he's got a fire in him now that he was picked in the fifth round. He thought he was going to be going a little bit earlier. That's adding more fuel to the fire, and that may go a long way to making the roster.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that long term, he's going to be a guy on the 53-man roster. He's going to be part of that, the pass rush packages that we've talked about where we can get as many edge rushers on the field as possible. And you see in some of these clips that he's got some of the same versatility that, Chop Robinson does, where he can stand up and rush also. One of the big things that I liked about this pick was that, like I said, I felt like these picks in the third day really help to fill some of the holes. And one of those holes for me was, like you said, he's more polished. Like he's a pretty polished player, just undersized. Whereas you compare him to somebody like Chop, who is super athletic, but not the same level of polish. Now I'm not saying that Mo's going to come in and he's going to start day one over Chop if our other guys aren't ready. But this is a guy that can come in from day one and he can help to contribute and he can, you know, help us to get to those third down packages where we can bring in the chops, we can, bring in the lighter guys and really get after the quarterback. So I really like the pick from that perspective.
And I think maybe where a little bit of the reason why he fell to the fifth round was because of his run defense. I mean, he's not an imposing guy in terms of athleticism or body type. He lacks that slice when you're forced to set the edge against bigger offensive linemen, the 6'6" tackles and guards, 6'7" tackles and guards, 300-pound tackles and guards as well. We know he's got a lot of power as well, but his arm length is, below 33 inches, which was good for the 10th percentile. Watching some of these clips, especially against the run, is there a cause for concern, and what are some things that he could improve upon?
I mean, his size is obviously a concern. Anytime that you have somebody that's 6'1" and then has shorter arms, like that's not a great combination. But one of the things that I was looking at, if you look over at the edge players that Greer has drafted, almost all of them have actually had less than 33-inch arms. Cameron Good's one of the rare ones that have longer, and I don't have a measurement on Phillips, but I imagine that one's longer. But the rest of them were under 33. So it's not like, we're unfamiliar with edges that have some shorter arms that are able to, still play some ball. I think one thing that helps Kamara is he does a really good job of playing with leverage. He uses that size to his advantage, and you can see that even when he is, rushing with power or attempting to hold up in the run, he's got good technique. Playing with that good leverage, playing low, and then using those hands to try to keep the offensive lineman off of him.
Right. Outside of this season, I don't really expect him to get a whole lot of majority snaps. I think he'll be a primarily third down pass rusher. I think he may be a stand-up guy, kind of like an Andrew Van Ginkel type of player early on in his career, being in those third down packages, just getting after the quarterback as well. I haven't really seen a lot of him in coverage as well, but I imagine they're not going to try and utilize him as such. But I do think, projecting his profile 2-3 years beyond, he spoke a lot about, his body type being compared to Von Miller's and now Tampa Bay's Shaq Barrett. Can he get onto Shaq Barrett's type of level?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of similarities there. I mean, they went to the same college, got similar measurements. Obviously going to be a great mentor having him in Miami with Mo. So yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously the ceiling. Anytime you're talking about, a fifth round pick, there's nothing guaranteed with that. But all signs point to him having the work ethic and the motivation to give him the best chance to reach that kind of ceiling.
All right, next up we have wide receiver Malik Washington from Virginia, and well, it, the Dolphins actually drafted a wide receiver, albeit it being in the sixth round as well in day 3. He was incredibly productive for the Cavaliers in his lone season as a Virginia Cavalier. He broke the single season school record of receptions and receiving yards, and those numbers made him one of the 10 Biletnikoff finalists. So, what does he actually bring in Miami? Number one, he's 5'8", 5'9", but he plays much bigger than his size. Like he plays like a receiver who's like 6'1", 6'2". He makes a lot of tough contested catches outside, and he can take hits over the middle. And especially important because, if Malik Washington is going to make this roster, specifically as a slot guy, he's going to need to work over the middle of the field. He's going to be, needed and counted upon, especially on the third downs when everyone is looking that the ball is going to be going Tyreek and Jalen Waddle's way. He's going to be the one grinding out those tough yards that the Dolphins desperately needed. For example, last season.
Yeah. So one thing I kind of like about this pick was the fact that it was this is a pick that Greer generated by signing Dan Feeney last year, and then rather than releasing Feeney, he was traded to Chicago. And this 6th-round pick was the one that was used to draft Malik Washington. A lot of the same things you said. If he was a little taller or ran a little faster, he'd have been a much higher pick. But being 5'8", 5'9", and running near a 4.5, you're not going to generate the buzz that some of the other guys do. But he's not your typical small receiver. He's 191 pounds, I think, is what he weighed in at the combine. He's very physical. I've seen the comparison to Jarvis Landry, and he might not be quite as feisty as a Landry, but he plays with the same kind of physicality. Like he's aggressive. He's not going to go down on first contact. When you look at some of these other smaller receivers, if you remember back to Jakeem Grant, a lot of frustration came from the fact that he was always a body catcher. And, he dropped a lot of he dropped balls because of that. He was not able to make contested catches because of that tendency. You don't have that with Malik Washington. He plays much bigger than that size. He catches the ball outside of his frame. He shows some great body control when he's able to go up and, twist in the air, reach out and snag a ball and still be able to stay on his feet. You see that multiple times. Highly productive in multiple good conferences. I mean, he played at Northwestern, so he was productive in the Big Ten, came over to the ACC and, blew the numbers out of the water with Virginia.
Right. I tend to see him more so along the lines of Khalil Shakir. Shakir's 6 foot. He played for the Buffalo Bills, similar body type, similar profile. Pretty tough in making catches over the middle of the field and can gain the yards after the catch. Besides Malik Washington's ball skills, one of the things that stood out when watching him was how he was used at Virginia. And it's similar to how, Miami uses Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. They line them up all over the field. Now, Malik, he lined up mainly in the slot, but he also took a lot of snaps from the H-back position. And that's something that the Dolphins used with Tyreek Hill last season to get him away from press coverage. And not only did Washington line up there, he runs pretty similar routes to what Tyreek Hill does. You put him into the slot, you motion him out. He can run the same amount of route that the dagger route, the dagger concept he can run with Jalen Waddle going up vertical and Malik Washington going in for the dig. And you could potentially have Tyreek Hill as a third receiver on the outside coming up on a crosser, or you could just basically flip the two itself. And, many of Washington's catches at Virginia, they came on timing routes, again, zone coverage in between the 5 to 12 area. And the thing I like about Malik Washington is that he's able to get a feel for the zone. He's able to sit there for a little bit, catch the ball, and run up the field. Similarly, like you said, with Jarvis Landry.
Yeah. You mentioned the comparisons to Tyreek and the way that he was used. You see him in a lot of pre-snap motions, which is something that, Miami did a lot with Tyreek, and you see that a lot with Malik Washington. Going into the draft, one of the things that I was, kind of hoping they would find was somebody that he's not going to be Tyreek and Jalen. Not going to find that in the 6th round, right? But he's the type of player that can run similar type of routes that can keep the timing of the offense. When they come in, it's not completely changing the timing or the play calls. So now this is somebody that you can substitute in for Jalen Waddle or Tyreek Hill, and you can still run the exact same concepts that you are running. And, hopefully having somebody like this will preserve those guys so that late in the season they're more healthy. And when we, get into a big game and we need Tyreek playing 90% of snaps, he's fresh in the playoffs or late in the season when it really counts, like he wasn't last year.
Yeah. And, for starters, when we're talking about routes and concepts and stuff, and when Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle are a little bit gassed, the Dolphins really love to run, that sharp motion and have it go into a slot fade or into a dagger concept as well. And that's what Malik Washington, he's really good at. He can use his quickness, albeit he's not super fast. He can get that quickness to get good leverage off the line and then track the ball over his shoulder. And, he was used a lot on double moves as well. Now, the offensive line will have to give Tua some time for him to find Washington on those double moves. And he ran out and up from the slot to a lot of good success last season. He's one of those receivers that, he's aware of zone coverage. He can find, those soft spots. He excels in quickness in those short areas between the 5 to 12 yards of the field. And that's going to be, the key on the third down. Now, what do you think the bottom line will be with Malik Washington? Do you think he'll be the de facto third wide receiver this season? Or, now that the Dolphins have Odell Beckham Jr., he'll still be learning and he'll be in for some sub packages?
I mean, I think that in terms of snaps, Odell Beckham Jr. is probably going to be more than what Malik Washington is. I think that Odell Beckham is going to be used a little more on the field at the same time as the other two. But like I said, this opens up the options of where, instead of always having Tyreek, Jalen, and Odell on the field, if, one of them is gassed, then you can go with Malik, Odell, and Jalen, and you've still got a pretty potent, three options there that you can get the ball to.
Right. And, when we're projecting this for the future, the Dolphins wide receiver room pretty much looks the same. You have guys who are sub 6 feet, excel in short area quickness, who are good to great route runners as well. And, the Dolphins just added depth into the wide receiver room. When Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle were down, you didn't have a bona fide number 2 on the field outside of Hill or Waddle when, they were not on the field together, and the Dolphins ran more so of 2 wide receiver sets. Do you think with the pick of Malik Washington and the inclusion of Odell Beckham Jr., they'll resort to more 11 personnel compared to 21 personnel this season?
I don't think so, just because I think that the concern over the height in the wide receiver room, I feel like it's a little maybe overblown, and part of that is because some of the tight ends that they have in that room are receiving tight ends, right? You've got Jonnu Smith, you've got Jody Fortson, you've got Julian Hill, who shows some good athleticism. So it's not like you don't have guys that can go up and get the ball. I don't feel like they had to force it to get a wide receiver that was 6'3", 6'4", and could go up and get the ball, because they do have those options in the tight end room. So I don't see them going to too much, changing the packages too much, because I think when you still have one of those tight ends on the field, then you still have that option also.
Yeah. As we move on from Malik Washington, I think the surprise in this 6th round was the Dolphins picking up a late round safety in Patrick McMorris. I thought they were going to go after another offensive lineman like Christian Mahogany, or potentially pick up another defensive player, rounded out and for special teams, and they picked up a safety. We know that Anthony Weaver's defense, they like to use multiple defensive backs, and they like to utilize 3 safeties as well. That's initially what I was thinking, but then, a picture on Nick Needham's account made me believe that Needham might be that third safety on the field. He's played safety, he's played slot corner, he's played outside corner as well. And, they have a pretty deep defensive back room. So was this pick for the future, or do you think McMorris was just, for special teams purposes?
Well, one thing is that from what I've, heard and read, is that this pick is one that Greer kind of gave to the scouting department. and let them, choose their guy. And it kind of makes sense because when you look at his athletic profile, it doesn't match up with the other defensive backs that Chris Greer has drafted. And as fans, we should really hope that this pick works out because it doesn't matter how good Greer and McDaniel are. If the scouting department's not bringing them, the good prospects that they really believe in and that they're hitting on, it's probably not going to go well long term. But in
Right.
terms of, my expectations for Patrick McMorris, getting onto the 53-man roster, it's going to be special teams for him. That's where he's going to have to contribute. As a 6th-round pick, even when he was drafted, never really pictured him as, being the third safety just because, you don't pick a guy in the 6th round and expect him to step in day
Right.
one and start. But I do think there is some similarities there between him and Nick Needham. I had posted a few days ago that a comparison for McMorris that I kind of like is Geno Stone from Baltimore. He was another lower round pick, a safety that didn't have the top end speed. You saw, if you go back a little further, you can look at like a Jarius Byrd that played with New Orleans and Buffalo. Again, a guy who ran, 4.5, 4.6, but he'd sit back there deep and kind of roam, use his instincts, and had good ball production. That was one thing that I found with McMorris was that if you go back and you look at his number of passes deflected, his interception numbers weren't high, but passes deflected, him getting his hands on the ball, were
Yeah.
higher than a lot of those safeties that were drafted much higher than him. And I
Yeah.
kind of
He
see the
had
same type of role with Nick Needham, right? He's not the most athletic guy. He's had a couple of injuries now. So I could see where if they don't add another safety, that Nick Needham is that Geno Stone deep safety, kind of ranging back there, and that McMorris can try to make the roster as a special teams player and backing up Needham in that role.
Right. You mentioned about his pass breakups. He had 23 pass breakups, 6 picks, 11 tackles for loss, and 252 tackles in his 5 seasons in college football. He started 40 games. Uh, he played 357 snaps at free safety, 247 snaps in box, and 171 at slot corner. You said it. He doesn't have the speed or the range to play deep, unlike a Geno Stone, unlike a Darius Byrd, but I see him more so as last year's safety pick within the 6th, 7th rounds from Atlanta, DeMarco Hellams, who played in Alabama. I see him more so as a guy where Anthony Weaver utilizes in the box, more so like a Brandon Jones type of player, where he can blitz the ball carrier, he can be that slot defender that can be blitzing, or the slot defender and maybe even nickel or dime packages where he's the third linebacker on the field. The issue with that is that McMorris doesn't really wrap up well consistently, and I think that's what made him drop. As a safety, you're the last line of defense for the entire defense. So a 10-yard run, which you could have tackled after 10 yards, ends up being a touchdown. And there's a couple of times on his tape where that has happened. He does a much better job closer to the line of scrimmage rather than deep, playing as like the pseudo linebacker role. And because of his instincts as a defensive back, he can find the receivers and tight ends inside of zone coverage, on the seams and in the flats, and make some plays on the ball. He's got good arm length to match up with the more physical tight ends, especially on the shallow route concepts where the Dolphins defense was burned, especially along the flats and the slants and towards the far side of the field. I think it's going to be interesting how Anthony Weaver is going to utilize him in the passing game. What are your thoughts on, using McMorris in the run game?
Yeah, I think that's certainly an option too. His issues in with tackling are not a willingness, type issue. So I think that when you're looking at, places that somebody can improve, you can teach somebody to tackle better than what they do, how they look coming out of college. It's tougher to teach somebody ball skills or reactionary skills. So I could certainly see, if he can come into camp and he can show that he's cleaning up his his technique and tackling, that could certainly be a place. And he's going to have to. I mean, if he's going to play special teams, the tackling has to improve.
Yeah, definitely the tackling has to improve. And I mean, he explodes coming downhill. He's able to fill the gap. He doesn't shy away from contact. And as you said, it's not because he's not willing to. He comes downhill. He's super smart, and he's a smart run defender that can take good angles in the box, where there is more help from second level defenders. Um, Again, with his missed tackles, he among the 2024 draft eligible safeties who took at least 200 snaps in run defense last season, he had a 24.1 missed tackle percentage. Now, are you able to properly teach tackling in the NFL during the rookie mini camp, during training camp, during special teams drill? I feel like that is to be seen on the NFL field. But Eric, since you are a coach, what are some things that you would teach McMorris to do to make this roster?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is going to be teaching him how to tackle properly, teaching him how to wrap up. I mean, it's all going to different defensive coordinators are going to have some different philosophies on how they want to tackle. You see, a lot of the rugby style tackling that, Seattle Seahawks made, pretty popular back with the Legion of Boom, stuff like that. So, I mean, that's the biggest thing. Whether it can happen in camp or not, I don't know. You would hope so, but as a 6th round pick, it's not like it's he's a lock to make the roster. If he can't figure out how to tackle better and contribute on special teams, then he could be a guy who ends up getting cut. Looking as most people didn't even have him on their boards at all, at least in terms of social media people. I don't know how the NFL really viewed him, but seems like a guy that if he got cut would have a decent chance of clearing waivers and coming back on the practice squad, where he could possibly continue to learn to improve the tackling and develop. So this, if he can clean up his tackling, could be a player that's on the 53 this year, helping out with special teams, maybe some sub packages here and there, but also a player that could be a practice squad candidate to develop down the road.
All right, maybe a potential practice squad candidate to develop down the road, and if there are injuries in the safety backfield, to call up for Patrick McMorris. Now, the last pick in the 2024 NFL Draft, which was their 7th round selection, in USC's Tahj Washington. When I thought of this pick, I'm like, pretty good punt/kick returner. But when I watched him a little bit more, I'm like, holy shit, they drafted another guy similar to Malik Washington. Now, Malik Washington is 5'8". Tahj Washington is 5'9", 170 pounds, a little bit more on the lighter side. And he can make contested catches in the air consistently, has strong hands. And, he's great along the middle of the field. He made a lot of tough catches through contact for now Bears quarterback Caleb Williams. And given how much Tua throws into the middle of the field, Tahj Washington should fit right in with this Miami Dolphins offense.
Yeah, I agree. When you're looking at drafting guys on day 3, to improve the wide receiver room, even before we knew about the Odell signing, but going into the draft, a lot of people were talking day 1, day 2 picks with wide receivers. And I think that everybody really likes the Malik Washington draft pick. But when you're drafting a guy in the 6th round, it's never a bad thing to hedge that bet by doubling down and getting another guy. And you see a lot of the same similarities with Tahj Washington. Like you said, he's not as big, as physical, but like I was talking about earlier with guys that can run similar routes to what Waddle and Hill can do, Tahj Washington can do, a lot of that same stuff. He's played at a very high level of football. It's not like we're getting a small school guy here. He's played against good defensive backs his entire career. So I think this is a good player to compete with Washington for whatever that 4th or 5th wide receiver role is going to end up being. And, if he can, outplay Berrios as a return man, he may even find his way, onto the field earlier than, most 7th round picks.
Right. So this is where my evaluation of him gets a little bit tricky. His route running is solid. Played against a lot of good defensive backs in Power Five. He makes every route look pretty similar, but it isn't because of his footwork, and he keeps the defensive backs off balance. He varies his speed, varies his timings. He leans into the defensive back, then comes out again with his head and with his body as well. He can control his body pretty well. He has good contact balance, and he can get open, especially across the field. But the issue is that when watching him, he doesn't create a lot of separation. He's not super duper quick, and he doesn't explode out of his breaks the way you would want a guy of Tahj Washington's size to be. Now, that separation quickness is pretty much an essential skill in this Miami Dolphins type of offense, especially for this size. Like, he can't play outside. Like, he's going to be pegged as a slot wide receiver. Again, similar to Tahj Washington, he can sit down on his routes against zone coverage, something the Dolphins offense values in their wide receivers. He doesn't have a lot of experience against press either. The Dolphins wide receivers, when pressed upon late in games and especially in the playoffs, we saw it. They couldn't do too much, and Tua couldn't get the ball out in time to make the throw. So it is going to be tricky to see where Washington falls in terms of the depth chart. As you said, he's going to be battling out with Malik Washington, Eric Ezekama, Braxton Berrios for that fourth, fifth, sixth wide receiver spot.
Yeah, I think one thing with Tahj Washington is even though he doesn't create separation versus man coverage, I think he's got a good feel of zone coverages. And like you said, the ability to throttle down and speed up through those zones. You got a quarterback like Caleb Williams, and he's able to, when the play goes off script, he's able to find that open space. And I know this isn't an Odell Beckham episode, but that's kind of something I see Odell being able to do in this offense, right? We've got Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. So these guys after that are going to be facing, the third, fourth, fifth option. So we're not asking them to beat somebody else's number one corner one-on-one. I think that the role for a lot of these guys is going to be more so, Tyreek and Jalen are going to be the 1 and 2 reads. And then, once we get through those, we need guys that can find open spaces in the field for easy completions. And I think that, when you look at Odell, when you look at Malik, when you look at Tahj, I can see all three of those guys being able to do that pretty well.
Right. And when you also got to factor in his yards after catch, he's pretty smooth getting across the field, going up the field, and with his contact balance, he's able to make defenders miss. Now, that was in college. This is the NFL. There are much bigger guys who can hit much harder and much faster, and they're grown men. Now, it's going to be a tough battle for him because he's going to have to battle out, obviously, Malik Washington, Odell Beckham Jr., Braxton Berrios, River Craycraft, Anthony Schwartz as well. But I think his making will be on special teams. He returned 24 kicks in college, around 450 yards. And, given the NFL's new kickoff rule, I think this is probably where Tahj Washington could have an impact next season. Braxton Berrios, he's an experienced return man, but his numbers were not good enough. They were kind of like below average or average, and Berrios didn't necessarily give the Dolphins good field position when needed to. And I think Washington may be able to give that to the Dolphins, especially on special teams. Have you ever watched Sketch, that the guy that goes, "What's up, brother? Special teams, special players, special plays." That may be Tahj Washington to become a special player on special teams for the Miami Dolphins.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that his best opportunity, because we do expect Odell to be that third receiver. We expect Malik to that wide receiver room starts to get very deep. And I do think that special teams is going to be where Tahj is going to have his best chance of making this roster.
So as we round out this Dolphins draft, what grade would you give this 2024 draft class initially?
Initially, I haven't really put a grade on it before, but I would probably say a B to B plus. And the reason for that is just because of the unknown at the top. It's very well a draft that, not next year, but 2-3 years down the road, if Chop and Patrick Paul develop the way that we think they can, it could very, very easily turn into a plus draft. Looking back, when we think about the positions they're filling and where their ceilings can be, at the same time, if those guys don't develop, then it could drop. But right now, I would say B to B plus. How do you feel about it?
I'm more so along the B plus as well. I think they got tremendous value out of the day 3 picks, especially with Kamara, Washington, McMorris, and Washington. Where they got Mo Kamara, Malik Washington was of surplus value if you take a look at, what their ranks were on the consensus big board as well. Even though they're not, average size for their positions, they're good technicians. They fit the scheme of the Dolphins offense and defense, and they could be good contributors 2 to 3 years down the line. Now, not to say that, McMorris and Tahj Washington may or may not make the team, but they filled positions of need where they needed help on special teams and depth. When we're talking about the first 2 to 3 picks for Chop Robinson, Patrick Paul, and Jalen Wright, they're coming into positions where I feel like they're not going to be starting immediately. It's going to be a slow build, and it's going to be about development. They're going to be mentored by starters at their positions, good starters at their positions in Teron Armstead, who could be a Hall of Famer one day. Raheem Mostert, who has had a career renaissance here in Miami, and edge rushers in Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips, and a defensive coordinator who excels on the defensive line. Chop Robinson's defensive line coach is going to be Austin Clark, who helped develop Christian Wilkins, Andrew Van Ginkel, your boy Zach Sealer as well. So it's going to be watching on the development of the first 3 picks and seeing if Kamara, Washington, both Washingtons, and McMorris can be contributors on special teams and those packages. So if that does happen, I think they could get an A minus, A plus in the coming future. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching right here on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. This is the Scouting Combine. Watch us here every Thursday on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. Go Fins.
See you next week, guys.